Hello, and welcome to Killer Combat Design Pro Tips from the Experts. My name is Joe Quadara. I'm a game designer and consultant helping indie devs. And today it's my pleasure to introduce to you this panel of esteemed gentlemen here that we've assembled. I don't know if the orientation is going to matter, but we're going to start with Jason DeHaris. He is lead combat designer for Star Wars Jedi: The Fallen Order and is now a design director on the Star Wars team at Respawn Entertainment. Jason, welcome.
How's it going? Thanks for having me.
Good to have you. Mihir Sheth, he has been a technical designer for much of the last decade, notably on the God of War franchise, and now is a lead combat designer at Sony Santa Monica. Mihir, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
And then last but not least, Eric Jacobus, action designer and founder of Super Alloy Interactive. Notable titles include God of War, where he was Kratos, Mortal Kombat, the upcoming Avengers game. Thank you for joining us, and welcome.
Awesome to be here. Thank you, and thank you, devcom. Thank you for having us on this panel.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought Eric invited me to sort of be on this panel, and I thought what an interesting sort of time and space to bring combat designers together with action designer like yourself, Eric. Maybe I thought before even getting into some of us talking shop, Eric, you could sort of describe to us what is it that you do. Like if you're at a cocktail party, nobody's ever met you before, and you say, I'm an action designer, what does that mean?
Well, I guess the way to kind of catch someone's attention is that I plan violence for entertainment purposes, right? That's kind of what a choreographer does. But then on the motion capture side of things, I put a suit on and it records all my movement and puts it into a computer. And so that when you run around as your little game character in the game, that might be me or somebody else who does motion capture.
Right. So it's like when people see the suits with all the little ping pong balls on them, that's the old style way of doing it, but that's definitely what you've been doing, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a current way. I mean, that technology's been around for a long time, but then there are many other ways to do it now, too.
Mm-hmm. Right on. And Jason, I'll turn to you for describing the role of a combat designer. If you're at a cocktail party or somebody's talking to you fresh from the industry and they'd never heard of that role, how do you describe it?
At least in my experience, it's like a game designer, except they focus on pretty much taking animations and scripting them to feel a certain way or perform a certain function, using scripting engines like maybe Unreal Engine 4, using like their in-engine behavior tree to make an AI perform certain roles or certain behaviors. And on top of that, I think it's a lot of collaboration with animators. It's like a partnership to kind of make something, make the combat experience. They own a piece of it, right? They could own an enemy, a boss, a hero mechanic, and it'd be up to them to kind of translate that fun into the game.
Yeah, and Mihir, I'll sort of like volley that question to you in a way. It seems that combat designer could be a solo job to anybody not understanding the role, but maybe if you took that sort of question, hey, so you do all that yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super collaborative role. I think that's one of the things that's really fun about it is that you work very closely with animation teams, with character art teams, as you're working on the characters themselves, with effects teams. And I think if you're the type of person that wants to gather all of that and kind of like piece it together and create a gameplay experience, and you could be tweaking effects, you could be tweaking little animations here and there, you just kind of get joy out of that. I think it's a really good fit for that.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You get joy out of spending, a month tweaking like a dog bite, a dog attack, which is like a little snapping bite, right? Do you enjoy, playtesting and then going back and tweaking that same move again, right? And making it feel better each and every time. So that's kind of the role, I think, is focusing on those little moments.
Is that kind of where it starts for you guys as becoming combat designers, when you realize that you enjoy that part of the process?
That's where it started for me. Using the dog example, or just kind of like just the basic humanoid enemy, is like, how do I make this one thing really stand out and really feel good? And I could spend maybe 3-4 days a week making sure it hits all the right notes, and that includes, like Mihir says, putting the right sound, the right effect, making sure it's readable, and like those little pieces, they add up. It's like the sum of the sum of all its parts. And that's just one little interaction, one little chess piece, one little enemy. And if you can make those like little fundamentals feel good, then I think that's just a good overall experience for the rest of the game.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I had my start in the game industry as what's called a technical designer, which is also kind of a weird specialized role. But I have a background in computer science, and I've always really liked, games. And I started working on character and NPC systems, so not really in combat, but a lot of the same learning goes through, right? Like, how do you get a character to open a door, right? Like that just breaking that down, every little thing, and then being like, well, what if I want to make this, like, I want to make this the funnest door to open, right? Like, I want to make the fun, big, revolving door of doors, right? So, like all the pieces that go into that, if you find that exciting, and then, you change the challenge a little bit, and be like, okay, well, instead of opening a door, now I want to grab another person and throw them on the floor, and start thinking about it the exact same way, it translates a lot more closely than I think a lot of people would realize.
Yeah, and it's something that you can spend a lot of time tuning and iterating on, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's it's a bit obsessive.
It is. There's so much nuance, I think, involved in, like, even just the basic swipe attack with the humanoid, right? You have to think about anticipation, how long it takes for it to hit the player. The distance of an attack is a really interesting nugget of how you design an attack. Does it travel, a couple meters? Does it travel like 10 meters? And like, how does that factor into how the animation reads? There's so many like moving parts. If you change one little thing, I think that's the really like joy in being a combat designer, is like there's so many moving parts, and you could think it's irrelevant to change like 2 frames or take away 3 frames, or to like take away 2 meters on an attack, so now it attacks shorter. But it's just like it's like a waterfall effect, right? It will change the moment to moment experience. And I think just having those kind of challenges, there's like a million of them as a combat designer, it just makes it fun. Even now as a design director, I'm still implementing because that's really fun to do, and it just helps me keep my brain sharp and like really understand like what kind of combat we're trying to make.
Jason, I gotta ask you, when was the moment where you knew that you wanted to be just combat designer for as long as you have been?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, before I worked at Sony Santa Monica, I was working on a SpongeBob game, and the lead designer of God of War, we kind of knew each other from the Street Fighter community. And he would ask me, why are you working on SpongeBob? I'm like, well, I like SpongeBob. This is like my first design role. This is amazing that you could be a game designer and implement cool platforming challenges or even collectibles, right? Like putting those in the world. And he's all, what do you think about working on God of War? And I'm like, oh, that's kind of like Street Fighter. It's kind of got some fundamentals there. And like, that's when I put in my head, oh, there's a job where I could kind of like take what I learned from, playing fighting games for a long time. And there's a way I could use that as kind of like, I don't know, like community college, and use that as a jumping point into like 4-year college, right? That's kind of how I thought about it. And like, it blew my mind, right? So I had to jump at the opportunity. Yes.
And I know that guy, and he's a great guy. What's up, Eric Williams? Mihir, I'm going to turn that same question to you, because you were a technical designer working on systems and wildlife, I'm sure, maybe weather systems, I don't know. But at some point you transitioned to being a combat designer. I'm curious when that moment clicked for you.
Yeah, so I actually did a lot of, again, to get even more specialized, combat technical design. So taking my learnings in making systems, it was like, well, how do we make systems for combat? So this could be anything from enemy positioning systems, right? Like, where do enemies want to stand in a fight, and why do they want to stand there? To how are they spawned? And this goes even to like spawning pipelines, and how do you give another designer the ability to say that this room is going to have these enemies and the other room is going to have those ones. And I started doing a lot of that, and then at some point in the development of God of War 2018, I had to jump on some more kind of traditional combat design challenges. One of which was the enemy hit reaction system, which for those watching who don't know what that means, it's every time someone does an attack, there's the person receiving the attack, right? And they have to respond accordingly. And when you see those two together, that's kind of what you register as, oh, that was a punch, right? It's the person punching, but it's also the person getting hit. Dove into that problem way longer than I thought it was going to be, and learned a lot. And I loved it. Like it affected me a lot more than I thought it would. And I dove down that rabbit hole, and then coming out of it, I was like, all right, this is aligning with me. So yeah, done a lot from the technical side to the design side, but and I still do that now. Even as a lead combat designer on the team, I'm still very closely involved with a lot of technical challenges as well as design.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, how hit reacts sell a game feel is so important.
Absolutely. Yep.
So Eric, I'll ask you a similar question, even though maybe I know the answer. Is what got you into mocap, and when did you decide you wanted to do it full time?
I come from a stunt and filmmaking background. I was inspired by Jackass back in the year 2000 and Hong Kong films. So we combined Jackass with Hong Kong films and made our like backyard Hong Kong action films with really cheap editing and ripped off sound effects from Hong Kong films and things like that. So, and I did that for about 15 years or so, and learned a lot about the technical side of filmmaking. I learned Premiere, After Effects, and all that. I was actually a programmer before all that. When I was 15, I was a PHP and Visual Basic programmer, so I had tech kind of in my blood. And then it was around like 2015, I was doing a lot of previs for movies, and I got a little bit burnt out with it. And because that tends to be what you do if you're a filmmaker and a stunt guy. You get pulled on to big projects to do previs for months at a time, and that means shooting previs all day for 8 hours, and then you go and edit all night so that you can have a rough by the next morning with sound, with all this, right? And after that was done, I was in China, I got really sick, came home, decided, I'm just gonna work on fitness and try and do something fun for my YouTube channel, and came up with this kind of crazy idea where I would copy Tekken moves from Tekken, just copy game character moves and just do the entire character list and just do it in my garage and then play it side by side to see, how closely I could kind of mimic the original animations from the game, which many of them were motion captured. And so I put those online and they went viral. And long story short, Santa Monica Studios saw it and they called me up and they said, you know how to move like a video game character, which I didn't know was a skill. And it was something, of course, it took me 30 of these Tekken in real life videos to sort of figure out. But every time I would do the shot, I would start in the idle pose. I would do the same kind of anticipation. I would do the same attack, the same side, same everything, even if it was my bad side, because I kicked on the wrong side. I had to relearn all my kicks. And same recovery time, and then end in the idle pose again. And I just thought, like, okay, that's just something that you can do. It's easy, right? But that ended up being a skill. So when I came in and they said, you would like to do Kratos for God of War, it was kind of second nature going from Tekken in real life to doing motion capture, because it was the same sort of language. And then did God of War for, I think it was about 2 years. And after that, Zach and I got together and got a motion capture system and decided, hey, let's just make our own motion capture and provide that as a service. And not just as a motion capture house, but as an action studio that can supply anything, including motion capture. And that's what Super Alloy ended up being.
And I saw recently that you got an updated space with the spring floor.
Yeah, it's a 4,000 square foot warehouse with a gymnastics floor, wire rigging, and all kinds of stuff. It's pretty perfect for doing action motion capture, because usually when you do motion capture, you have to you're doing it on a concrete slab with some carpet on it maybe, or it might be rubber flooring. It's very rare. I don't know if it ever happens where you do motion capture on a gymnastics floor, because the nice thing about a gymnastics floor is you can fall on it and it doesn't hurt. But it doesn't, when you look at the data in motion capture, it doesn't look like you're falling on a pad. It's not squishy. Whereas if you fall on a pad using motion capture, it gets a little bit squishy and they have to fix that stuff. So we'll just fall on the spring floor now, and it saves them a little bit of time on the back end. And it's just one of those little things. I mean, it's nice to do previs on it too, because you can fall on it very easily for movies and things like that.
That's awesome. Congratulations on that. So Eric, still sticking with you for a minute, just talking about when we're doing a shoot say it's any one of us combat designers talking to you, what sort of preparation do you like to go to before shoot day?
Well, I'll give an example. So when we were doing God of War, and at the time when I was doing God of War, I was also doing some Mafia 3 at the time, and that's how we met, Joe, because God of War wasn't my first motion capture job. It was actually Mafia 3. But what was really nice about doing God of War was that they would give me a reference dump anytime I would go in for a shoot. And so I would often take an extra day or so beforehand and sort of go over all the reference that was in their head, where it's like we're trying to accomplish this move, and then there would always be this. We always joke that there's always Naruto reference in there somewhere. There's always Naruto in there somewhere, and it's like the posing is Naruto, the footwork is from King of Fighters. The drama is from Assassin's Creed, and then there's something from a Marvel movie, probably a pose, right? And so I learned to kind of dissect all that and focus on what the animators were looking at, because I didn't think like an animator. I was thinking like a stunt guy. So they'd show me reference from a Marvel movie, and I would think, oh, you want that move? No, it's just sort of the pose, but we don't want the entire thing. We just want the pose. But then how you get into it is totally different. For example, so I learned how to take apart reference, and that was a huge learning experience, because now anytime a project comes in and they don't do that, we ask for it. We say straight up, hey, if we don't have this, it's going to burn a lot of time when we're doing the shoot, because you're not going to be able to explain what you need. So a nice reference dive the day before, a consultation talking about how you want the character to move, how you want how you want the animation to look at the end also is incredibly important, because that will tell us what we need to focus on as performers. And I think that if you can over prep motion capture like that, you end up getting it on the first or second take, rather than doing 10, 12, 15 takes, and you're burning out your performer. He hates you by the end of the day, and you wonder like, man, motion capture sucks. Why did I get into this? And it's like, well, a little bit of prep goes so far. That was the major takeaway that I got from doing God of War, is that they would prep really well, and we would even previs some days. We did like previs days, just using a GoPro, and that stuff. I mean, that doubled doubled productivity for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think even leading up to that, including on that Mafia team, what they would typically do is last minute type out a shot list and be like, okay, one-handed sword attack right, and just looking at the list and trying to decipher it right in there in that moment. Yeah.
And I guess it depends on your workflow. I mean, if your animation or your combat system is not tight, if you're not trying to get it exactly on the mocap volume, okay, do 1 or 2 takes, and then a bunch of animators are going to fix it up later. But sometimes they don't want that, And in God of War, they really didn't want to mess with the animation too much, so they would try and get the perfect take.
So it sounds like there's definitely some back and forth and talking, just even in that prep stage of like, here's some reference, what did you call it with the GoPro, like some previs? Yeah,
and when I was doing Avengers, I at one point when I was doing Hulk, when I showed up on the first day of doing Hulk, I'd already done Thor, and when I showed up to do Hulk, I stopped. I said, "Can we just talk for an hour?" And they kind of went, "Oh, okay, sure." And then we ended up getting it for a second take every time. That kind of, and even like at the beginning of the day, it was extremely helpful. The back and forth, like you can't overprice that enough.
Makes a lot of sense. So bringing a lot of the character and expectations up front rather than trying to do it in the moment. Got it. Mihir, I'm going to move over to you talking about taking that mocap data. So once Eric's done his thing, or anybody else, and we've got actions, hit reacts, running, jumping, attacks, what happens to that animation? We plug it, we bring it in the engine. I'm just going to like jump straight ahead. We put a couple button mechanics on there, and then lo and behold, it feels sluggish, and it's the dreaded phrase. It feels unresponsive. And why is that, and what do we do with that?
That's a very deep question. There's a lot to talk about there, and that's something that I think as a player, it's very intuitive to you, right? Like people will just say like, oh, it feels, floaty is a word used a lot, and I could write, as I'm sure Jason could write an essay on what makes things floaty. But I think it goes back to the whole process, right? Because there's not like one silver bullet. Like a lot of times people think like, oh, it's missing some, hit stop or hit pause, or it needs to be played back at 1.25 speed. Yeah, those are tools, but you need to have a solid understanding of why something is feeling satisfying and why something isn't. And it goes kind of rewinding a little bit. Before we have someone like Eric go into his suit, the reason a lot of that previs is important is because it starts with understanding poses. And in animation, when you think of an animation, it's just a series of poses being played back, right? But within there are kind of key poses. There are key things that you need to read, and the moment you see it, you understand, right? So we talk about it a lot in design as anticipation, hit, and recovery. And what that means is that, before I attack you, I'm going to look a certain way that lets you understand, oh, I'm about to attack you, right? Then there's the actual moment of attack. And then you have the recovery, which is I finished the attack, and that's where you're going to get, was it a heavy attack? Was it, is the person overcommitted? As well as some of those poses just look really iconic and they look really good. So the way that we found a lot of success in this is before we even talk about motion, let's talk about poses. Because if you understand the poses, it's like comic books, right? Like you fill in the gaps a lot of the time. And if you have strong poses for every one of those moments and you kind of link between them, you sell motion that is a lot more compelling. But to kind of go, once you're past that stage and you have the animations in, and by the way, there's a lot of back and forth with the animation teams kind of taking that mocap data and playing around with it, right? Trying to keep the things that are unique that are added, like personality. But poses themselves, often we designers and animators will work to identify what is that pose, and then we'll get someone like Eric, hey, we want you to hit this pose at this certain time, and that's where some of the iteration is going to go through with that mocap shoot. Once it's in, the things I mentioned before, there's so many little techniques from in how we do timing. Like I think one thing that has helped a lot, and Sony Santa Monica Studio has been doing this for such a long time, is being able for a designer to play around with the timing of an animation very, very loosely, like sectioning off an animation, right? So if I get an animation, I can play around with this little part of it I can speed up, or that little part of it I can slow down. And I can sketch out what I think feels good. And then I can kind of discuss that with people. We can get, all on the same page. And then, animators like, okay, I get what you want. I get that this feels good. And we don't, we definitely go first through what feels good versus what's realistic. We'll try to take what's realistic and blend it in and keep some of that performance, but feel is the most important aspect.
It's really cool that you brought up that point of being able to section off animations yourself as a designer in the engine. Jason, sort of like put that to you because I see you nodding. Have you ever tried to iterate on animations without being able to section it off and just sort of like communicate and frame data or whatever else?
My mind can't even fathom how that would be possible as a combat designer. Just what Mihir said, once we get the animation in the game and we've done all that prep work and that back and forth, that anim rate specifically is like one of the fundamental tools, I think, of a melee combat designer, because it's so fast and iterative and we don't need to re-export an animation. We could have other combat designers or anybody play it instantly. And, we have limits, right, to where eventually we probably want to have the animator actually do it in Maya, but for just the purpose of our getting the feel right, the anim rate is probably one of the most important tools.
Yeah, so basically we're taking the animation, we're stitching it up or sectioning it off, and we're playing with the timings of those and it sounds like I'm interpreting this as we break it up into maybe an anticipation sort of section, the hit, the actualization, and then the recovery, and then we can sort of play with the timings in engine basically without caring too much about are the feet planted correctly, are the fingers in the right space.
Yeah, it's literally slowing it down or speeding it up, and sometimes we try to find optimal frame ranges to speed up and slow down, at least try to find that balance, but usually we're just butchering the animation depending on the type of animation. So
that reminds me of an anecdote where I once worked with one of the animators that was on the Tekken franchise, Kento Kojima, and when I was showing him these Tekken videos that Eric was doing, he looked at it and he just was astonished that Eric was doing some of these combos, because he was like, the designers just sectioned off those animations and stitched together animations that had no business going together. And Kendo would spend all night trying to figure out, how am I going to make this like hell swoop go into an uppercut or whatever it was. And here Eric was actually performing the move.
Yeah, some of those are hard.
Yeah, no kidding. And it reminds me of this thing that I recently saw, Eric, you showed off. It was a YouTube video, or maybe it was a quick little clip, but you had these kind of action dice that you were throwing out on stage. Tell me more about those. What do those do?
Action dice, named by Joe himself, actually. It's a good name. So I should have brought them with me, but essentially, if you could imagine blank dice, six-sided dice, and each die represents some part of a move. And we're talking about if you're like just using a character, for example, if you were to be Kratos swinging an axe, just single melee attack, right? The entire move has the beginning pose, and then you have the anticipation, the hit, and then the recovery, and then the out pose. And so what I did was, okay, what if you just take, take those pieces, make each die one of those sections of the move, and then randomize what it is that happens. So you could have a long antic, a short antic, you could have an antic that's low, an antic that's high, and then on the move die, maybe you have horizontal slash, or you have a spinning slash, or a jumping attack, maybe a vertical attack, and then the recovery one is you could have a fast recovery, slow recovery, you could have a taunt at the end, maybe throw some character in it. And then you take all those dice and you just roll them. And maybe you throw in a weapons die while you're at it too, and just randomize it. And then you get kind of a random assortment. And you take all that stuff and you say, okay, do that one move. And you have to kind of take all of those pieces, those little layers of that one move, which all happens within about, I don't know, like a second and a half to 2 seconds. That's really the amount of time that you have to accomplish this thing. And if you can do that, then it's like, that's kind of the mocap, the in-game motion capture experience, if you wanted to call it that. Because what keeps happening is that as a performer, when you're on the volume, you're asked to do this move, and they say, okay, change the anticipation. Okay, now change the anticipation and the recovery. Okay, but now you got to change both of those, and your hitbox is not right. You got to do a vertical hitbox. And if you really wanted to simulate that, just roll those 3 dice randomly and then try and do that. So that's what I'm starting to use to teach people how in-game motion capture actually works. And it's a part of your brain that is not normally exercised in other parts of life. It's this very kind of specific mode that you get into where you can start layering critique and also be able to kind of apply these new things to your body and accomplish that movement.
That's really cool. So it came about from you teaching other action designers?
It came about because I want to teach other performers how to do this. Because here's what's happening is that a lot of people get into motion capture and they think it's Andy Serkis, they think it's performance capture. And that's maybe half of it. I actually don't know the percentage, but the percentage that I get brought onto is like 90% of what I get brought onto is in-game motion capture. In a given game, it's like 90% of it's going to be standing there in idle, do the move, go back to idle, and you do that for 8 hours. It's way different than performance capture. So people are taking motion capture classes and they're learning PCAP, great. That's totally different. That's like night and day. If I were to compare it to martial arts, PCAP is like capoeira. In-game motion capture is like traditional Japanese sword, where the sensei is drilling you that your angle is not perfect. It's not at the correct degree. It's 1 degree off. Drill, 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 drill. Get it perfect, get it perfect, get it perfect. Okay, you got it. Move on. Next. Drill, 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 drill. No, you got to get it perfect, get it perfect. Move it up. So that's what I want to teach, is like a very different skill set than the traditional PCAP classes.
That's really cool. So I imagine we're going to have a whole cohort of junior Erics running around.
That's the idea.
That's cool.
Like it or not.
Well, there was a phrase that got thrown around when we were talking about discussion topics, and it is this term called the combat puzzle. And I thought that was a great phrase, just because it turns our heads in terms of like, what are we talking about when we talk about a combat puzzle? Mihir, Jason, who wants to take that one?
Mihir,
Jason, you can go. Oh, look at this. We're both courteous gentlemen.
Oh yes.
Sure. I'll start, and then we can bounce off on this one. But when we say the term the combat puzzle, this is a very like player-centric way of thinking about combat, right? Because you can break combat down to kind of what we're talking about, which is a bit more atomic, a bit more like individual moves, individual attacks. But that's not how players think about combat. If you think about combat, or if you see a movie and you see a scene, it's like, what are you going to do to get out of this? You walk into a room, there's 6 different people around, 2 guys have a crowbar, one has a gun. Like, okay, in your head, you're thinking, what do I need to do to handle all of this? What test is each different opponent presenting to me, right? And in game design, it works pretty much the exact same way. We have encounters, right? So combat, oftentimes the combat teams create the individual chess pieces, but it's the encounters team that creates the chessboard. And they're like, okay, hey, we're going to put this specific enemy here. And as a player, you already know this, right? Like if you've played any kind of combat game, you have your ranged enemies, which are kind of in the back. You got the melee enemies that are going to run up to you and rush you down. Then there's always going to be that one like tanky guy who walks into the room and you're like, no, it's like that's all there for the purpose of providing a puzzle to you that we're asking you as the player, what are your combat tools? What can you do as the player, and how are you going to use them to solve this puzzle the way that you would solve any other puzzle in the environment? And there's a lot more to go into here, but I think that a lot of times the fun aspect about combat, all of this feel stuff is great, but it really shines when it comes together, and the cohesive puzzle experience is satisfying because you're making interesting and meaningful choices. And that's, making something fun for 5 minutes. Sure, something can just feel great, and that's great. But if you're going to make something fun for hours and hours on play, you need to be engaged, and that's where encounters, really shine. Jason, anything you want to add to that?
That's a pretty good one. I think for Star Wars, at least, that's how we approach it, right? We try to make sure the level designers who originally did the encounters, they kind of have all the right pieces, or at least the bare minimum archetypes, as Mihir puts it, to actually put in the playfield and try to get something off the ground. Like the range and the melee combo, that's like the classic, I guess, setup, right? There's a ranged enemy in the back that just sits there, literally doesn't move, and shoots at a certain frequency, and then the melee guys will rush you down. And in Star Wars, they die in 1 hit or 2 hits, but the fact that they're composed, or the composition is such, that creates a different challenge. But we have to sustain this for 20 hours? So the other part of the puzzle, at least on the dev side, is the combat designers coming up with just this macro cast of enemies that kind of have certain things we want to touch on. Like there's a range, but there's a grading of ranged enemies. There's a simple ranged enemy. There's like a minor ranged enemy that maybe has an alternate shot that's something you can't block. So there's all this nuance of a matrix, pretty much, that we try to like graph out, at least on paper, just to get something high level. And then from there we start thinking about each one as an individual. How can that be fun in the moment? And then from there we have a discussion with level design and making sure what are the goals of the encounters. And I mean, we could go on forever talking about it, but that's kind of the high level of the combat team working with the level design team.
Yeah, and as you're talking about it, it just starts to become so clear how combat is not just any one person's job, right? This is what you just named sounds like an entire team could be iterating on that for months.
Yep,
years.
and that's at Sony, starting on God of War 2018, I think, is when we made a dedicated encounters team. And shout outs to that team, because they were put in the position of work with levels, work with combat, and try to create these interesting encounters. And I love that challenge. And I love that team, because that's where you see your work as a combat designer shine. Like, that's the fun stuff. When we iterate and we're building, we're in a test level most of the time. A combat designer is gonna most of the time run a test level that doesn't have a lot of art in it. It's probably gonna be some gray box level, and they're gonna have their character there, and they're gonna be playing with that character hours and hours and hours for months on end. And so they're not oftentimes aware of the whole chessboard. And if we can trust the encounter designers to, hey, take care of the chessboard, and I'll make sure that the individual chess pieces are really good, you get some amazing synergy there. And this has been alive in games for a really long time. I think players intuitively have a good understanding of this. And it's not just melee action games. I look, Halo is a really good example of a shooter that kind of took this idea in encounters and really doubled down on it early on, and I think it influenced a lot of shooter development. And Jason and I have had some of the similar mentors on the Sony Santa Monica team in combat, and they completely think this way as well. So it's a really powerful tool.
I actually had a question for Mihir. How do you know when you're missing like the certain archetype? How do you know like what's missing, right? It's like,
yeah, no, for sure.
You may not hit the whole cast in the beginning, right? So
yeah, I think it's the way that we look at it through playtesting is what are the player tools and what do we want to see players doing. And what I mean by that is I'm going to jump in a little bit into like combat design theory here. And for anyone who plays fighting games, you're very, very familiar with this. But fighting games as a whole are built on the principle of rock, paper, scissors. And that's kind of the framework and how it works, right? So you can think of like, very broadly speaking, attacking, defending, and throwing. And there's kind of like a Rochambeau connection between them. And so what we're in a lot of action games today, you have so many tools. So the rock, paper, scissors now is actually like 6 things, 7 things, 8 things or more. And what we want to be looking at is like, okay, are players using those things when they're supposed to? Sometimes, a game can give you 20 different options, but the core of it is really only like 5 or 6. And we're like, okay, it's okay if the player isn't doing the crazy advanced combo that's deep within the skill tree, but wow, they're not even blocking. That's a problem. So we need enemies to kind of help them understand that blocking is a tool that you have and you're going to have to use it. So I think it starts off with understanding the player design and being like, what do you want players to do? Filling out archetypes, testing your thesis in a playtest, and then being like, you know what, we're still not seeing players using X, Y, and Z. Okay, how do we adjust the enemies to enforce that behavior or encourage that behavior? It's a whole other topic in and of itself, but kind of loosely, I think, addresses that.
Yeah. I do like to start there. I kind of start with the extremes. Let's say, for a simple example, this is the character that you always want to block, right? This is another character that you always want to evade, right? Because of its speed or just the way it attacks or the distance of its attack. So I think that's something I thought was successful, especially if characters die quickly. I think you'd accentuate those kind of encouragers or whatever descriptors you want to call it that push the player to do certain things or make them feel out of their comfort zone. I think if you could hit some of those notes, I think that's a good thing, even though they may be polarizing. Some players may hate certain enemies, but I think that's always a good start.
Jason, there was something I wanted to ask you just off to the side, and I don't even know what to call this, but in Jedi Fallen Order, it seems to me, when I'm watching your Twitter feed, and I've seen a couple like GIFs of this, is that there are enemies, or maybe just boss enemies, that have sort of these hidden kind of like one-shot moves, and there's some like, it seems like combat Easter eggs.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about those and what brought those on?
The general like high-level pillar, I think, of the Jedi game when we were making it was thinking of like golf, like the less amount of hits the better, because it's a lightsaber, right? So we wanted to build in certain logical leaps into like enemies. If you parry them, certain moves that you could actually kill them in one hit. So that was kind of where we started. We didn't necessarily plan out each enemy to like, okay, this enemy A is going to have this one hit shortcut, right? Or this enemy is going to have it during this. We just kind of like naturally found certain moves that they would do that makes sense. If you could like, it's a risk reward thing. So if this move was really hard to parry, but you could land it, then you should be rewarded and just kill them, right? So I think those kind of windows, and we didn't really telegraph it in terms of like a tutorial or anything. You just kind of learned it or looked for it, and it kind of like let the animation tease you a little bit. And the easiest way to do that, right? Long wind-ups, a big obvious pose that it's going to attack, and then lunge and experiment, right? Since we have the red unblockable sheen or effect, and if you didn't see that, then you could parry anything, right? So just something to kind of gain some mastery and just replayability. And I think it worked out. Not every enemy had it, but the ones that did, I think it felt good, especially going back to encounters, right? If you saw that enemy, you're going to make it a high-value target if you're good enough and if you're really comfortable with parrying it to get the one-hit kill. So it becomes strategic as you get better at the game. Yeah. Yeah.
Hearing both of you talk about, or all three of you talk about your craft, it just reminds me of how intensely technical it is, but also how much it's like, here you said it sort of mid-stride, you were just talking about getting the player to make interesting and meaningful choices. And Eric, you were talking about bringing the character and yeah, I know I'm playing Hulk, but how am I playing Hulk? And that marriage of narrative and story to the player through all this technical know-how and all this knowledge is just amazing to see on display and understand how much we're just scratching the surface, but so much goes into what you guys do. So thank you. Going to kind of move into our wrapping up stage here, and I was thinking for anybody that's watching us talk about this, wanting to know how to get started in your respective fields. I'll go around and I'll end with Eric. I'll start with Jason because I know it's been on his mind a bit. But what skills do you look for, and what advice would you give to people looking to get in?
Well, I think one, overall, they just want to be passionate about making games. They want to have a designer's mind, not necessarily a combat designer's mind. Just they like to put the pieces of the puzzle together. They like to solve a wide range of problems, small, big, and then specifically for a combat designer, do you like character action games, right? Do you like those little pieces? Are you satisfied when you play like DMC and you land like very frame intensive moves, or do you like a certain enemy? Is there something fun about that you could recognize and analyze? Are you good at extracting personality out of certain concepts, like what makes getting hit fun, right? Some people don't think about that one. Like, how do you make hitting something fun, right? What's the engaging aspect of that? And generally, we look for combat designers that just understand the interactions between two things, like a character and the hero, and kind of have like an imaginative imagination, right, about how certain things work in terms of combat. Which I kind of went around the circle in that answer, but
it's not an easy question. If it was an easy question, it would probably be more people like us, right?
But technically, it's do you like playing with animations? Do you like scripting things? Do you like scripting behaviors of AI? Do you like working with character art and figuring out what's the best way the creature should look like to accommodate the combat? There's all this just collaboration that affects combat. It's not just technical timing or effects, right? It's everything, animation effects. But the concept from the start, right? Does it look like it could hit and be flexible and read, and strike the right pose and all that stuff? So it starts from the very beginning. Is that something you want to be involved in from that all the way to implementing an animation, tuning numbers? You could be tuning, just variables for a week, and that's all you're doing at one point in the lifespan of the character, right? So
attention to detail, focus,
high level attention to detail, yeah.
Like jack of all trades, interest and understanding of how things work. That's quite a lot.
Yeah.
Mihir, what advice would you give to people looking to get into being a combat designer?
I get asked this question a lot, and I typically reply with some of the things that Jason's already covered, which is that, well, first of all, you're a game designer, so all of the giant set of skills required to just be a game designer, there's a lot there. But specifically for combat, I think, and if you're wanting to get into it, you have to be a bit realistic on what are you likely to be doing if you're getting into it. And I'm going to speak with what I'm familiar with, which is modern AAA combat action games, specifically melee combat action games. And you're probably not going to come on board as someone getting into this and like redesign an entire combat system, right? More often than not, when you have someone starting in combat design, they are likely going to be on enemy design and enemy implementation. This is most of the time when the game systems are understood, the player mechanics are understood, and there's a framework, right? And the whole point of this is that you're going to focus on these kind of chess pieces that we talked about earlier, and you're going to go through the entire pipeline, right? So any enemy, let's take the basic grunt, which is actually in most games the most complex enemy to make, but I'm using that for this example. From the beginning, from working with narrative on what that character is, to working with concept art, to what should it look like, to then character art, how it's built out. getting animations, putting it in game. Like that process of just taking something from start to finish, where implementation is extremely highly valued, I think is the number one advice that I give to people looking to get in. Like any familiarity you can have with state machines, with AI systems or behavior trees, lots of different ones out there. Implementation is going to be your biggest strong suit early on. It's not going to be necessarily, I have this brilliant idea for an entire combat system, which might be true, you know, and there might be a time and place for that. But I think starting off, when we interview for this thing, we're looking at is, can you work with all of these disciplines? Are you willing to work with animation? Are you willing to work with art? Take their work and know that they're relying on you to make their stuff sing, right? Like I think that's one thing as a game designer, and especially as a combat designer, is that you're really a character owner. And looking at it from that perspective, I think changes it a little bit. So yeah, I think animations and state machines and that kind of scripting, I think, is super important. And we've had really good success, I think, over the years of trying to hire junior talent. Again, Jason, a lot of experience as well. But it's really nice to see more and more people, I think, get into combat design. It's been a pretty small pool for a very long time.
Yeah, Mihir, I think you said it, ownership. You're going to own that thing to the very end, most likely, especially if you're at a place where they value autonomy and ownership and responsibility and seeing it through. And implementation is obviously super important, because the minute you get from paper to implementation, you may find out like certain things just don't work. And you're going to find that instantly when you start implementing an attack in something, or, its whole suite of moves. And you may find out you have to go back to the drawing board, but you are the owner. You're the one that controls that. You're going to be the one, like Mihir says, where people are going to rely on you to find that fun and fail as fast as possible, because you're the one actually doing the nuts and bolts, right? You're the one putting together animation lists and being very detailed, like here's what the animations do. I mean, even if there's mocap, but just generally you're describing how this enemy is going to exist in the experience, right? So there's so many things that you touch, and there's so many things, because you do touch them, that could just make things fall apart. So
not afraid to get your hands dirty with implementation. I really appreciate that just description of it, because it really sets sort of a good framework for anybody coming in. It's like, you're not going to be the ideas person. We need you to get in there and implement it. And to Jason's point, that's where a lot of the times you got to go back to the drawing board anyway, because the original idea wasn't even going to work. It's great. Mr. Jacobus, somebody wanted getting into mocap and doing video game specifically, in-game
I think, I don't know how many people out there actually want to perform this stuff. There might be a lot of people who are interested in directing it or producing it, perhaps. And it's all kind of part and parcel to what we do. And I would say this, that the directors that I've worked with that really know their stuff are ones who would show me the move and they would freak me out because they would do it better than me. Now, sometimes it's like, I can't do it more than once, but here's the general thought, is that if you are able to do something, then you can understand it. Action breeds understanding. So, for example, Muhammad Ali, the reason he could see punches coming a mile away is not because he was really good at watching punches. That doesn't actually get better over time. You can't really see a punch better, but you can see a foot move, you can see a hip move, you can see a twitch in the shoulder. These are things that you start learning when you do a punch thousands and thousands and thousands of times. You start to be able to read other people's intention to do those things. So what I'm getting at is this. If you want to understand action, then it's really good to do the action yourself. So for example, if there was a martial art game, I think that it would be an amazing experience to just bring the animation team through some martial art classes. And it doesn't even have to be specifically about what they're doing, but I think any amount of action understanding that you can develop within their mirror neuron systems can only help the process. And that helps with senior animators too, even if they're not even touching animation, just them being able to look at animation. And that helps with directing performers and helping to kind of craft what you want out of somebody, because I've seen it with guys that are just purely armchair combat guys, and they just do not understand human movement in general. They'll ask you to do kind of impossible things, and then they might get frustrated, or they'll say, we'll just fix it later, and they don't really have a creative way they don't really have a good way of phrasing what they want. And so I would recommend anybody wanting to get into this, if you want to get into combat, go to the shooting range, go take archery, whatever it might be. I think it can only help you.
Yeah, totally. I'm looking at my bow and arrow right here. Actually, it's like been fantastic in terms of getting me outdoors, and learning how my body works. It's like, oh my god, my posture is terrible. I've been sitting in front of a computer screen for 10 years of my life. Let me fix my posture. Totally agree with that.
And then as you correct your own posture, you start to be able to see other people's posture. So if I don't know anything about archery. If I went out and held a bow and arrow, you'd look at me automatically. You say, no, hold on. And so it can only help.
It's a scary thought to think you got to go out there and jump off of buildings to learn how to do it. But you're right. It's like you only learn by doing. Huh?
Yeah, you just keep it to within some specific domain, right? Like keep it within a safe domain. You don't have to go extreme sports, but I think that if your game is if there's a heavy emphasis on melee combat, you just know that the animators that have actually done this stuff are going to have a better eye for it. And I've seen that myself, like animators who have had some experience, any experience at all, it's just they far kind of they can kind of outperform other animators.
Awesome. Well, we've definitely reached the end of our time, so I'm going to just go around the way one more time with Jason, Mihir, and Eric. Thank you very much. Give you a moment to give shout outs or follows on Twitter, sign off, and then we'll go. Jason?
Not much. You can follow me on Twitter, Jason DeHarris. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, I guess
Cool.
shout outs to
Mihir?
Semi-Santa Monica combat and animation teams. It's a blast to do what we do. Hope more people are interested in it. And you can follow me on Twitter. I think my Twitter handle is you there, me here. So feel very clever about that one.
Well, yes, I should shout out to the Respawn Star Wars team because we have a great combat team and a great animation team. I mean, just a great team in general, but the fact that we have a specific combat team is, I think, a testament to just the company Respawn allowing us to focus on that, which I think is super important, obviously.
Yeah, to our audience, I will just say these two guys here represent the top world-class combat teams that I have ever seen, and it's untouchable until the next one comes around, but looking forward to seeing who that is going to be. Eric, shout outs, follows.
Shout outs to 2K. They gave me my first big mocap job, and that was with you, Joe, so thank you. Santa Monica Studio for God of War. That was my mocap 101 class. NetherRealm also learning martial art mocap with Carlos Piscina. And follow Super Alloy on Twitter as Super Alloy Co. And my personal is Eric Jacobus on Twitter. I do a lot of action breakdowns and I talk about animation now. I'm starting to understand that stuff.
Right on. Well, thank you all for joining us. Again, I've been Joe Quadara. You can find me at recurver.com. And shout out to Eric Williams, who without him, I don't think any of us would be here. And
That's true.
That's it. Have a great DevCom. And I think we'll be around for a Q&A later. We'll see. But
All right.
signing off. Bye.